I discovered my own invisibility on a Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in my daughter-in-law's pristine kitchen while she spoke about me as if I were already dead. Honestly, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, Sandra was saying into her phone. Her back turned to me as she arranged white tulips in a crystal vase. She's becoming such a burden. David feels guilty, but I told him we have our own lives to think about. I stood there holding a casserole dish I'd brought, tuna noodle, David's favorite since he was 7. The ceramic still warm against my palms. Through the archway, I could see my son in his home office, hunched over his laptop, completely absorbed in whatever was more important than his mother's weekly visit. The house smells like old person now, Sandra continued, lowering her voice, but not enough. And she's always here, every Tuesday like clockwork. It's suffocating. The tulips were beautiful, white and perfect. Nothing like the cheerful daisies I used to bring before Sandra had gently suggested I let her handle the decorating. I watched her arrange them with the precision of someone who'd never had to make do, never had to stretch a dollar until it screamed. We're thinking of moving to the coast, she said. David doesn't know yet, but I found this perfect place in Carmel, far enough away that she couldn't just show up. My hands didn't shake. Not then. I simply stood there, absorbing the weight of being discussed, like a problem to be solved, a burden to be shifted elsewhere. The casserole felt heavier with each word, as if it were filling with the years I'd spent believing I mattered to the family I'd helped raise. Oh, she'll be fine, Sandra laughed to sound like breaking glass. She's tougher than she looks. Probably outlive us all, out of spite. I set the dish on the counter with deliberate care, the small clink of ceramic against granite somehow thunderous in my ears. Sandra didn't turn around. I gathered my purse, my keys, and what remained of my dignity, and walked out through the front door. I'd helped David paint last spring when Sandra decided the old color was too provincial. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign by the time I pulled into my driveway, the same driveway where David had learned to ride a bike, where I'd taught him to parallel park, in my old Buick. I was no longer the woman who'd walked into that kitchen with hope and tuna casserole. I was someone else entirely. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold and stared at the phone. David usually called after my visits, a perfunctory, "Thanks for stopping by, Mom," that I'd treasured like a lifeline. The phone remained silent. I thought about the 37 years I'd lived in this house, the meals I'd cooked, the scraped knees I'd bandaged, the bedtime stories I'd read until my voice went hoarse. I thought about Richard, my late husband, and how he'd worried in his final days about leaving me alone. "Promise me you won't let them forget you," he'd whispered from his hospital bed, his fingers cold in mine. "Promise me you'll fight to be seen." I'd promised. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped fighting and started apologizing for taking up space, for having opinions, for existing beyond their convenience. The humiliation came in waves over the following days. I found myself analyzing every interaction, every forced smile, every "we should have lunch soon." That never materialized into actual plans. I remembered last Christmas when Sandra had seated me at the children's table because there wasn't enough room with the adults. I remembered my birthday dinner when they'd chosen a restaurant I couldn't afford and then looked annoyed when I ordered just a soup and salad. But it was the small things that cut deepest. The way Sandra would redirect my stories mid-sentence. The way David's attention would drift whenever I spoke. The way my grandchildren, Emma and Jake, had gradually stopped running to hug me. When I arrived, trained by subtle cues that Grandma Ruth was more obligation than joy. I'd become a ghost in my own family's life, and I'd help them make me disappear. On Friday, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I called in sick to my volunteer position at the library. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, expressed genuine concern. When was the last time anyone in my family had done that? And told me to take care of myself. Instead of shelving books and helping patrons find romance novels, I spent the day in my attic pulling down boxes I hadn't opened since Richard died. Inside I found our old tax returns, insurance papers, and something I'd forgotten existed. Richard's life insurance. The one that had paid off the house and left me with more money than I'd ever mentioned to David and Sandra. I'd been careful with it, living modestly, investing wisely on the advice of Richard's old friend at the bank. I'd wanted to leave something substantial for David and the grandchildren, a final gift to show how much I'd loved them. But why should I leave anything to people who were already planning to put distance between us? That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to James Morrison, the estate attorney who'd handled Richard's will. The second was to my sister Margaret in Phoenix, who had been begging me to visit for years. Ruthie? Margaret's voice was warm with surprise. What's gotten into you? You sound different? I'm planning a trip, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. A long one. On Monday, instead of my usual Tuesday visit preparation, I drove to James Morrison's office. He was a kind man in his 60s, with the sort of patient demeanor that made you want to tell him your troubles. But I hadn't come for sympathy. I want to change my will, I said, without preamble. Remove David as beneficiary. James raised an eyebrow, but didn't look shocked. After 40 years of practice, he'd probably seen every family drama imaginable. May I ask what's prompted this decision? I told him about the kitchen, about Sandra's phone call, about the gradual erosion of my place in their lives. I told him about the children's table and the restaurant where I couldn't afford an entree. I told him about feeling like a burden in my own son's home. I see, he said when I finished. And what would you like to do instead? I want to set up a trust, I said. And for scholarships for kids who need help with college but don't have families who can provide it. We spent 2 hours going over the details. The house, the investments, the savings I'd carefully accumulated, all of it, would go to the Ruth and Richard Bennett Education Trust. David would receive a small bequest, enough to cover the cost of my funeral with a little left over. It seemed appropriate somehow. As James walked me to the door, he paused. Ruth, you know, this is final once we file it. Are you certain? I thought about David as a little boy, how he used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I thought about the way he'd cried when his father died, how he'd promised to take care of me. I thought about the woman I'd been when I still believed those promises meant something. I'm certain, I said. Instead, I drove to the travel agency downtown and booked a flight to Phoenix. 3 weeks, I told the cheerful agent. Maybe longer. The first call was David, sounding puzzled. Mom, Sandra said you didn't come by today. Are you feeling all right? I'm feeling quite well, actually, I said. I've decided to visit your Aunt Margaret. Oh. There was a pause. For how long? I'm not sure yet. Well, you could have told us. Could I have? I asked. But he'd already moved on, talking about some project at work that was consuming his attention. I let him talk, made appropriate sounds at the right moments, and hung up, feeling lighter than I had in years. The second call was from Sandra. Her voice had a sharp edge I'd never heard directed at me before. Ruth, David says you're going to Arizona. We had plans this weekend. I was going to ask you to watch Emma and Jake while we went to Napa. I'm sorry, I said, though I wasn't. I won't be available. When will you be back? I haven't decided. There was a long pause. This is very inconsiderate, Ruth. We depend on you. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Do you? Of course we do. Your family, the word sat between us like a stone. I thought about all the ways I'd been family to them. The babysitting, the holiday preparations, the emergency meals when Sandra was too busy or tired to cook. I thought about all the ways they'd been family to me, the obligatory phone calls, the perfunctory invitations, the careful distance that kept me close enough to be useful, but far enough away to be ignored. I'll call you when I get back, I said, and hung up before she could respond. Phoenix was a revelation. Margaret lived in a retirement community that felt more like a resort, with palm trees and a swimming pool and neighbors who actually seemed to enjoy each other's company. She welcomed me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been genuinely lonely for companionship, not just convenience. "You look tired, Ruthie," she said as we sat by her pool on my second day there, drinking iced tea and watching the sun paint the desert mountains gold. "Like you've been carrying something heavy." "I have been," I said, and found myself telling her everything. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "I'm not going back to being invisible," I said. "I'm 73 years old, Margaret. If not now, when?" She smiled, the same mischievous grin she'd had as a child when she was plotting some harmless rebellion. "Good for you, sister. It's about damn time." I stayed in Phoenix for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of morning swims and afternoon bridge games with Margaret's friends, who welcomed me like I'd always been part of their circle. 6 weeks of dinners where no one looked at their phone or redirected my stories or made me feel like I was taking up too much space. David called every few days at first, then weekly, then less frequently. Sandra stopped calling altogether after I politely declined to cut my trip short for Emma's soccer tournament. "But she's expecting you to be there," David protested during one of our conversations. "Is she?" I asked. "Or is she expecting you to have arranged for her grandmother to be there?" He couldn't answer that, and we both knew why. When I finally returned home in early June, everything looked the same but felt different. The house that had seemed so empty without Richard's presence now felt peaceful instead of lonely. My own space, my own rules, my own quiet rhythms. I'd been home for 3 days when David appeared on my doorstep. Looking uncertain in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, caught breaking curfew. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "You're back." "I am." He shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Can I come in? We need to talk." I considered this. The old Ruth would have rushed to welcome him, offered coffee and cookies, asked about his work and the children. The new Ruth simply stepped aside and let him enter. We sat in the living room where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby, where I'd helped him with homework through high school, where I'd listened to him talk about his dreams for the future. He looked around as if seeing it for the first time. "The house looks good," he said finally. "Thank you, Mom, about these past few weeks." "Months," I corrected. "It's been months, David." He flushed. "Right. Months. Sandra and I have been talking, and we realize we may have taken you for granted." "May have." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. "Go on," I said. "We want to make it up to you." "We were thinking maybe you could move closer to us. There's a nice senior community near our neighborhood. You'd have more company and we could see you more often." I studied my son's face, looking for the boy who used to build blanket forts in this very room, who used to tell me I was the best mom in the whole world. He was still there somewhere, but buried under years of assumption and entitlement. "That's a generous offer," I said. "But I'm quite happy here. But, Mom, you're getting older. What if something happens?" "What if you need help? Then I'll ask for it," I said, "from people who actually want to help." His face darkened. "That's not fair. Of course we want to help." "Do you? Or do you want to manage me? There's a difference." That one question told me everything I needed to know about how my son saw me, as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. "Yes, David," I said quietly. "There's a difference." He left soon after, promising to call more often, to visit more regularly. I nodded politely and didn't tell him I'd heard those promises before. That night, I called James Morrison and told him to proceed with filing the new will. Summer passed peacefully. I took up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try. I joined a book club at the community center where my opinions were actually solicited and valued. I volunteered at the animal shelter where the dogs and cats didn't care about my age or my usefulness to their lives. They were simply grateful for attention and kindness. David did call more often, and he did visit more regularly, but there was a performative quality to it that hadn't been there before. He was checking boxes, fulfilling obligations. Sandra came to, sometimes making an effort that felt forced and temporary. The grandchildren were polite but distant, like visitors in a foreign country trying to observe local customs they didn't understand. Emma, now 16, spent most of her visits texting. Jake, 13, seemed more interested in my Wi-Fi password than in talking to me. I didn't blame them. Children learn what they live, and they'd learn to see me as a duty rather than a delight. In September, Margaret came to visit me for the first time in 15 years. She stayed for a week, and we had a wonderful time exploring the city I'd lived in for decades but rarely truly seen. We went to museums and concerts, had lunch at restaurants I'd never tried, laughed until our sides hurt over shared memories of our childhood. "You seem different, Ruthie," she said on her last night as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "Stronger somehow." "I stopped waiting for permission to live my own life," I said. "And how does that feel like?" But free, October brought an unexpected visitor, Emma, my granddaughter, who showed up on a Saturday afternoon looking upset and defiant. "Can I talk to you, Grandma?" she asked, using the name she'd abandoned somewhere around age 12 in favor of a more distant grandmother, Ruth. "Of course, sweetheart." We sat in the kitchen where I'd fed her countless snacks over the years, where I'd listened to her chatter about school and friends and dreams. She was 17 now, on the verge of adulthood, but in that moment she looked very young. "I heard Mom and Dad talking," she said without preamble, "about you, about money." My stomach tightened. "What did you hear?" "Mom was upset about something. She said you changed your will, that you were being spiteful and petty. Dad told her to drop it, but she said you were probably going senile and maybe they should contest it." I felt the familiar sting of being discussed like a problem to be solved. But this time it was tempered by something else, the knowledge that I'd already solved myself. "What do you think?" I asked Emma. She looked up at me with eyes that were suddenly much older than 17. "I think you're the sanest person in our family." We talked for 2 hours. Really talked the way we used to when she was little and still believed that grown-ups had all the answers. She told me about feeling caught between her parents' expectations and her own dreams, about the pressure to be perfect in a house where love felt conditional on performance. "I'm scared I'm going to end up like them," she said finally, "so focused on what other people think that I forget who I am." "Then don't," I said simply. "Choose differently." When she left, she hugged me tight. The first genuine physical affection I'd received from any of them in years. "I love you, Grandma," she whispered. "Not because I'm supposed to, but because I want to." After she was gone, I sat in the gathering darkness and felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. November came, with its promise of holidays and family gatherings. Sandra called to discuss Thanksgiving plans, her voice bright with forced cheer. "We thought it might be nice to have it at your house this year," she said. "More traditional, and you're such a wonderful cook." I almost laughed. After months of minimal contact, suddenly they needed my house and my cooking. The old Ruth would have been thrilled, would have spent weeks preparing and cleaning and cooking, would have been grateful for the opportunity to serve. "That won't work for me," I said calmly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I have other plans." There was a pause. "What other plans?" "I'm spending Thanksgiving with Margaret in Phoenix." But it's Thanksgiving, it's family time." "Yes," I said, "it is." The silence stretched between us like a bridge. Neither of us wanted to cross. Finally, Sandra spoke, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is ridiculous, Ruth. You're punishing us for something we don't even understand." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm just no longer available for things that don't bring me joy. We're your family." "Are you?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take it back. "Because families don't discuss moving across the country to avoid each other. Families don't see grandmothers at the children's table. Families don't call each other burdens." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She knew I knew. "Ruth, I heard every word." The confession sat between us like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples in all directions. When she spoke again, her voice was small, almost childlike. "I was having a bad day, and that's okay. We're all entitled to our feelings. But I'm also entitled to mine, and I'm entitled to choose how I spend my time and energy." She hung up without saying goodbye. David called an hour later, his voice tight with frustration. "Mom, what's going on? Sandra's upset, the kids are confused, And I don't understand why you're being so difficult. Difficult. There was that word again, the one reserved for women who stopped accommodating everyone else's needs at the expense of their own. I'm not being difficult, David. I'm being different. Different how? I thought about how to explain it, how to make him understand that I'd spent months learning to distinguish between being alone and being lonely, between being needed. I'm being true to myself for the first time in 20 years, I said finally. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done apologizing for existing. I'm done making myself smaller so other people can feel bigger. I'm done being grateful for scraps when I've been serving the feast. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, uncertain. I don't understand. I know, I said, and realized that this might be the saddest truth of all. I know you don't. I spent Thanksgiving in Phoenix with Margaret and her friends, eating turkey and stuffing around a table where every person's presence was celebrated rather than endured. We told stories and laughed and argued good-naturedly about politics and movies and whether the cranberry sauce is too sweet this year. No one looked at their phone. No one redirected my stories. No one treated me like I was taking up too much space. You look happy, Ruthie, Margaret said as we cleaned dishes together after dinner. Really happy. I am, I said, surprised to realize it was true. December brought Christmas card season, and for the first time in decades, I didn't send one to David and Sandra. I also didn't receive one from them. The absence felt more like relief than loss. Emma called on Christmas Eve. She was at college now, studying sociology with a minor in women's studies, a choice that apparently caused great consternation in her parents' house. I wanted to thank you, she said, for what you told me in October about choosing differently. You don't need to thank me for that. Yes, I do, because I did choose differently. I'm not coming home for Christmas. I felt a stab of sympathy for David and Sandra, despite everything. Where will you go? I'm volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving Christmas dinner to people who don't have families, or whose families don't want them. She paused. I keep thinking about what you said about being grateful for scraps when you've been serving the feast. I don't want to serve scraps anymore, Grandma. I want to serve feasts. After she hung up, I sat in my quiet house and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, pride in my family. Not the whole family, perhaps, but the part that mattered most, the part that was choosing love over obligation, truth over convenience. The new year came quietly. I was reading in my living room when the doorbell rang on a cold January afternoon. Through the peephole, I saw David standing on my porch, holding a large envelope and looking older than I remembered. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I let him in, noting the way his eyes moved around the living room as if cataloging changes. The house looked the same, but I knew I didn't. 6 months of living for myself had changed something fundamental in my posture, my bearing, the way I occupied space. "I brought something," he said, holding out the envelope, "from Sandra." Inside was a card, one of those generic thinking of you types, with flowers on the front. The handwritten message inside was brief. "I'm sorry for what I said. I hope we can start over." I set the card aside and looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, and gradually lost to his own assumptions about what I owed him. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think she's sorry she got caught," I said. "Not sorry for feeling it," he flinched. "That's pretty harsh, Mom." "Is it? David, tell me honestly. When was the last time you called me because you wanted to hear my voice? Not because it was expected, not because Sandra reminded you, but because you genuinely missed talking to your mother." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. "When was the last time you asked my opinion about something that mattered to you? When was the last time you included me in a decision that affected my own life? Mom, when was the last time you saw me as a person rather than a responsibility?" The questions hung in the air between us like accusations, but they weren't accusations. They were simply truths that had been waiting too long to be spoken. David sat down heavily in the chair where his father used to read the evening paper. "I don't know," he said finally. "I honestly don't know." It wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, but it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in months. "I've been a terrible son, haven't I?" he continued, his voice breaking slightly. I studied his face, looking for the boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared, who used to think I could fix anything with a kiss and a Band-Aid. Not terrible, I said carefully, just absent. I don't know how to fix this. I'm not sure it can be fixed, I said, and watched him flinch again. But it might be possible to build something new. What would that look like? I thought about Emma, about her choice to serve feasts instead of scraps. I thought about Margaret and her friends, about relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligation. I thought about the woman I'd become over the past months and the woman I never wanted to be again. It would look like honesty, I said. It would look like seeing me as a whole person with my own wants and needs and opinions. It would look like making space for me in your life. Because you want me there, not because you think you should want me there. He nodded slowly. And if I can't do that, then we'll both survive it. He left shortly after, promising to think about what I'd said. I watched him drive away and felt neither hope nor despair. Just a calm acceptance of whatever came next. Spring arrived early that year, filling my garden with daffodils and tulips that seemed brighter than I remembered. I was deadheading roses on a warm April morning when a car pulled into my driveway. Emma climbed out, followed by a young man I didn't recognize. "Grandma!" she called, running across the lawn to hug me. "I want you to meet someone." The young man was her boyfriend, Marcus, a pre-med student with kind eyes and a firm handshake. They were both glowing with the particular radiance of young people in love. "We have news," Emma said, practically bouncing with excitement. "We're getting married next summer after graduation." I felt a complex mix of emotions: joy for Emma, worry about her youth, and a sharp awareness of how this news would be received by her parents. "Congratulations," I said, hugging them both. "Tell me everything." We spent the afternoon on my porch drinking lemonade and talking about their plans. They wanted a small wedding, simple and authentic. They'd been saving money from part-time jobs. They were planning to move to Chicago, where Marcus had been accepted to medical school. "What do your parents think?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Emma's face. "Dad keeps talking about how I'm too young, how I should focus on my career first. Mom keeps hinting about what kind of wedding they'd prefer to help pay for." "And what do you want?" "We want to start our lives together," Marcus said quietly. "We want to make our own choices about our own future." I looked at these two young people, so full of hope and determination, and felt an echo of my own recent awakening. They were choosing themselves over others' expectations, just as I had. "Then that's what you should do," I said. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Even if Mom and Dad don't approve." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and meant it completely. They left that evening with promises to stay in touch, to include me in their planning. After they were gone, I sat on my porch and watched the sun set, thinking about cycles and choices and the way love can survive even when it has to travel underground for a while. The phone rang 2 days later. David's voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. "Mom, Emma tells me you're encouraging this ridiculous wedding plan. I'm supporting her choice to live her own life. She's 21. She doesn't know what she wants yet. She knows she wants to marry someone who makes her happy. That seems like a good start." "You don't understand the financial implications, David," I interrupted. "She doesn't need your money. She needs your blessing. It's really not." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David listing all the reasons Emma should wait, and me quietly refusing to agree with him. When he finally hung up in frustration, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity for my son, who had learned to equate love with control, who couldn't see the difference between guidance and manipulation. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I wrote David a letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual letter, handwritten on my good stationery. "Dear David, I've been thinking about our conversation today, and about all our conversations over the past year. I realize I've never adequately explained what happened to change our relationship so dramatically. For years after your father died, I lived my life according to what I thought you needed from me. I tried to be the mother I thought you wanted, available, undemanding, grateful for whatever attention you could spare. I made myself smaller and smaller, hoping that if I took up less space, if I needed less, you might find more room for me in your busy life. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of who I was outside of who I was, too. I became a supporting character in my own life, waiting for you to write my scenes. The day I heard Sandra say those things in her kitchen wasn't the day you lost me. It was the day I found myself again. I don't tell you this to hurt you or to blame you. You learned to take me for granted because I taught you to. I gave and gave until giving became all I knew how to do, until receiving felt foreign and asking felt impossible. But I'm not that woman anymore. I can't be her anymore, even if it would be easier for all of us. Emma is 21, the same age I was when I married your father. We didn't know what we were doing either, but we learned together. We chose love over fear again and again, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. If you try to control Emma's choices, you'll lose her, the same way you lost me, not through any single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small dismissals, 1,000 subtle messages that her judgment can't be trusted, that her happiness matters less than your comfort. I hope you'll choose differently. I hope you'll choose to trust her the way I'm learning to trust myself. Your mother, Ruth. I mailed the letter the next morning and tried not to think about what his response might be. Emma's wedding took place on a perfect June day in a small park overlooking the lake. Maybe 40 people attended, friends from college, Marcus's family, a few relatives who had driven in from out of state. David and Sandra were notably absent. I wore my best dress, the blue one, with the tiny flowers that Richard had always loved. And I cried during the ceremony, not from sadness, but from the pure joy of watching two people choose each other freely, without reservation or condition. At the reception, Emma pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for being here, for supporting us, to choosing me over them." "I didn't choose you over them," I said gently. "I chose love over fear. There's a difference." She hugged me tight, and I breathed in her happiness like perfume. That night, back home in my quiet house, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete contentment with my own choices. I had chosen authenticity over approval, self-respect over family peace, truth over convenience. It had cost me my relationship with my son, at least for now, but it had given me back my relationship with myself. And that felt like a fair trade. A year passed. Emma and Marcus sent postcards from Chicago full of news about medical school and Emma's job at a nonprofit. Margaret visited twice, and I visited her once, taking my first airplane trip in 20 years. I joined a hiking group and discovered I loved the rhythm of walking through forests with people who valued silence as much as conversation. The house remained mine, my sanctuary and my choice. I painted the kitchen yellow because I'd always wanted yellow walls and Richard had preferred white. I planted a vegetable garden and learned to preserve tomatoes and make my own pickles. I adopted a cat from the shelter. A dignified orange tabby who seemed to understand that we were both starting over. On a warm autumn day, almost 2 years after that devastating conversation in Sandra's kitchen, I was raking leaves when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. David got out slowly, like someone approaching a door he wasn't sure would open for him. "Mom," he said, standing at the edge of my yard, as if asking permission to enter. I leaned on my rake and studied his face. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. But there was something else there, too, something that might have been humility. "David, I got your letter. I know it's been a long time, but I've been thinking about what you wrote. And I think you were right about a lot of things." He paused, looking down at his shoes. "Emma won't speak to me. She sent a Christmas card, but she won't take my calls." I felt a stab of sadness for him, despite everything. "I'm sorry to hear that. She blames me for you not being at the..." She says, "I drove away the only person in the family who ever really saw her." "Did you?" He looked up at me then, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Yes." I think I did. We stood there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the detritus of another year ending. I could hear children playing in a yard down the street. The distant hum of traffic, the whisper of wind through the trees I'd watched grow tall over 4 decades of living in this place. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally, any of it. Maybe it doesn't need fixing, I said. Maybe it just needs accepting. I miss her, Mom. I miss Emma. And I miss you. I miss having you in my life. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure could bear our weight. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, hungry for exactly these words, willing to accept any crumb of acknowledgement or affection. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I know you do, I said gently. And I'm sorry for your pain, but missing someone and knowing how to love them are two different things. His face crumpled slightly. Can you teach me how to love you better? The question caught me off guard. In all our years together, through his childhood and adolescence and adulthood, he had never asked me to teach him anything about relationships, about emotions, about the delicate art of caring for another person's heart. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know if I can teach what you need to learn. But you could try. We could try. I looked at my son, this man who carried my eyes and his father's stubborn chin, who had once been my whole world and then had gradually demoted me to the edges of his. I thought about Emma building a new life in Chicago with someone who saw her completely. I thought about Margaret, who welcomed me with open arms whenever I appeared on her doorstep. I thought about the hiking group, where I was valued for my stories and my laugh and my willingness to share my trail mix. If we tried, I said slowly, it would have to be different, completely different. I won't go back to being who I was before. I wouldn't want you to. You say that now. But David, I'm not convenient anymore. I won't be available whenever you need something. I won't pretend to be happy when I'm not. I won't make myself smaller so you can feel more comfortable. He nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. And I won't be the grandmother who shows up with gifts and bakes cookies and asks for nothing in return. That woman is gone. What would you want in return? The question was so simple, so direct, that it took my breath away. When was the last time anyone in my family had asked what I wanted? I want to be seen, I said, not as a role or a function, but as a person. I want my opinions to matter, my feelings to be considered, my presence to be genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Okay? I want honesty even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And I want time, real time, not just the leftover minutes after everyone else has been taken care of. I want to matter enough to be a priority sometimes. He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then he said, what about Sandra? She's not great with this kind of thing. I almost smiled at the understatement. Sandra and I may never be friends, David. We may never be more than polite to each other. And that's okay. I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to stop expecting me to accommodate her discomfort at the expense of my own dignity. She feels bad about what she said. I'm sure she does. But feeling bad isn't the same as understanding why it was hurtful, and it's certainly not the same as changing the behavior that led to it. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. My cat, Hemingway, appeared from wherever he had been napping and wound himself around my legs, purring like a small engine. Would you like to come in, I asked? I could make coffee. David's face brightened with something that might have been hope. I'd like that. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and helped him with algebra homework, and listened to him practice his lines for the high school play. But this time felt different. This time we were meeting as adults, negotiating the terms of a relationship between equals. Tell me about your life, I said as I poured coffee into the cups Richard and I had received as a wedding gift 47 years ago. Really tell me, not the sanitized version you think I want to hear. So he did. He told me about his job, which he found mostly tedious, but paid well. He told me about his marriage, which had become more partnership than romance. Two people managing a household and raising children, but rarely connecting on any deeper level. He told me about his fears for Emma, his confusion about Jake, who was struggling in school and seemed angry all the time. I don't know how to talk to him, David admitted. He's so closed off, baby. How old is he now? 15. God, Mom, I don't remember being that difficult when I was his age. I sipped my coffee and considered this. You weren't difficult. Jake probably is too, but how do I help him? How do I reach him? The same way I'm hoping you'll reach me, I said. By seeing him for who he is, not who you think he should be. By asking what he needs instead of telling him what you think he needs. By making space for him to be imperfect and still loved. David stared into his coffee cup. I think I've been doing everything wrong. Not wrong, I said. Just incomplete. When he left that evening, we didn't make any grand promises or declarations. We simply agreed to try to call each other once a week, to have dinner together once a month, to approach each other with curiosity instead of assumption. It was a small beginning, but it was honest, and honesty felt like enough. Over the following months, David kept his word. He called every Tuesday not to check a box on his mental to-do list, but to actually talk. He told me about his work frustrations, his worries about Jake, his slow recognition that his marriage might need the same kind of honest renegotiation we were attempting. I told him about my hiking group, about the watercolor class I joined, about Hemingway's ongoing war with the neighborhood squirrels. I told him about the scholarship fund I'd established. Not the details, just that I was finding ways to help young people pursue their dreams. In December, he asked if I'd like to have Christmas dinner with him. Just the four of us. He said Sandra's parents are going on a cruise, and I thought maybe we could try a quieter kind of holiday. I considered this carefully. What does Sandra think about that idea? She's willing to try. She knows she needs to make amends. And Jake, David sighed. Jake doesn't care about anything these days. But Emma said she'd come if you'd be there. Emma. My granddaughter, who had chosen love over fear, who was building a life based on her own values rather than others' expectations. All right, I said if everyone contributes or we order takeout. Christmas Day arrived gray and cold with the promise of snow in the air. I arrived at David's house carrying homemade rolls and a bottle of wine, dressed in the red sweater Emma had given me for my birthday. Sandra met me at the door, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. She'd aged in the past 2 years, her face carrying new lines of worry and weariness. But there was something different in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of wary respect. Ruth, she said, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. It wasn't much, but it was civil, and civil felt like progress. The house looked the same, but the atmosphere was different. Quieter, more tentative. Jake, now 17 and taller than his father, mumbled a greeting and disappeared upstairs. Emma, radiant with the particular glow of a young woman deeply in love, threw her arms around me and whispered, I'm so glad you're here. Dinner was careful. We all moved around each other like people learning a new dance, uncertain of the steps, but committed to not treading on each other's toes. Sandra asked about my cat. David asked about my painting class. I asked about Jake's school. And though he only shrugged in response, he didn't leave the table. After dinner, Emma and I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while the others watched football in the living room. How are things with your parents? I asked quietly. Better, she said, not perfect. Dad's trying anyway. Mom's having a harder time, but she's trying too. And Marcus? Emma's face lit up. He's wonderful. We're talking about starting a family in a few years after he finishes his residency. Great-grandchildren. The thought filled me with a joy I hadn't expected to feel again. What about you, Grandma? Are you happy? I dried a plate slowly, considering the question. Yes, I said, not in the way I used to think happiness should look, but in a way that feels true to who I actually am. That night, as I drove home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, grateful for scraps, apologizing for existing, making herself smaller and smaller in hopes of being loved. That woman felt like someone I'd known once but could barely remember. The woman I was now lived in a house filled with her own choices, surrounded by people who valued her presence, secure in the knowledge that she mattered, not because of what she could provide for others, but simply because she existed. Spring came early again, and with it, a phone call that changed everything.
Mrs. Bennett, the voice was professional, kind. This is Dr.
Patricia Williams from City General Hospital. I'm calling about your son, David. He's been in an accident. The world tilted sideways. All my newfound independence, all my carefully constructed boundaries, all my hard-won self-respect, none of it mattered in the face of my child's need. I was at the hospital within 20 minutes, still wearing my gardening clothes and panic in my chest. Sandra was already there, pale and shaking, clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. "How is he?" I asked. "Surgery," she said without looking at me. Drunk driver ran a red light. David's car took the full impact on the passenger side. We sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, not talking much, just existing in the terrible space between before and after. Emma arrived from Chicago, her face streaked with tears. Jake came from school, looking younger than his 17 years and more frightened than he wanted to admit. When Dr. Williams finally emerged, still in her scrubs, we all stood at once. "He's stable," she said, and we all exhaled together. "He has a broken leg, 3 broken ribs, and a mild concussion." He was very lucky. David looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes and the antiseptic smell of industrial healing. His eyes found mine as soon as I walked into the room. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "You came." "Of course I came. I was so scared you wouldn't." After everything, I took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "I will always come when you really need me, David." That was never the question. What was the question? I smoothed his hair back from his forehead the way I had when he was small and running a fever. The question was whether you needed me or just needed someone to fill a role. He closed his eyes. "I need you, Mom, not the role." Over the next week, I spent most of my time at the hospital. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to be there. This was love stripped of performance and expectation. Just the simple animal need to care for my wounded child, Sandra. And I developed a rhythm of care, taking shifts, bringing each other coffee, sharing the wordless communion of 2 women who loved the same man in different ways. We didn't become friends, but we became allies in David's healing. Jake surprised everyone by appointing himself his father's entertainment committee, bringing books and magazines and stories from school. For the first time in months, I saw him smile, really smile, as he described a particularly absurd scene from his chemistry class. And Emma visited twice, driving down from Chicago with Marcus, who impressed everyone with his quiet competence and genuine warmth. Watching Emma with her father, I saw the beginning of a bridge being built between them, constructed of honesty and mutual respect. 2 weeks after the accident, David came home. He would need physical therapy for the leg, and he'd be working from home for a while, but he was healing. We were all healing in different ways. One afternoon, as I was helping him up the stairs to his bedroom, he paused on the landing. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I went to see Emma after Christmas. In Chicago, I waited. I met Marcus properly, spent time with them both. They're really happy. Mom's really solid. I was wrong to oppose their marriage." "Did you tell Emma that?" "I did. And I asked for her forgiveness." And he smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since the accident. "She said she learned about forgiveness from watching you. She said you taught her that loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do, but it also doesn't mean writing them off when they're ready to change." That night, I sat on my own porch with Hemingway, purring in my lap, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. My phone rang. Margaret, calling for our weekly check-in. "How's David doing?" she asked. "Better, much better. And how are you doing?" I thought about it. In the space of 3 years, I'd lost my family and found myself. I'd grieved the relationships I'd thought I had and built new ones based on truth instead of wishful thinking. I'd discovered that being alone was not the same as being lonely, and that being loved was not the same as being needed. "I'm doing well," I said. "Really well. No regrets?" I looked through my kitchen window where the yellow walls caught the lamplight and threw it back in warm, welcoming waves. I thought about the trust fund that would help young people pursue their dreams long after I was gone. I thought about Emma and Marcus building a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. I thought about David finally learning to see the people he loved as individuals rather than extensions of his own needs. "No regrets," I said. "Only gratitude." The first was a renewal of David and Sandra's vows. A quiet ceremony in their backyard, witnessed by family and close friends. It was Sandra's idea, David told me, her way of marking a new beginning in their relationship. "We're going to counseling," Sandra said, as we stood together watching David arrange chairs under the apple tree. Learning how to talk to each other, really talk. It was the first time she'd confided in me about anything personal, and I was touched by the gesture. The second wedding was Emma's medical school graduation party, which she and Marcus decided to treat as a second celebration of their marriage. This time, David and Sandra were there, beaming with pride as Emma received her diploma. At the reception, David pulled me aside. "I have something for you," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a check, not a large amount, but significant. "What's this for?" Emma told me about the scholarship fund I want to contribute. I stared at the check, then at my son. "David, you don't have to..." They deserve to have someone in their corner, someone who sees their potential and wants to help them reach it. He paused. "The way you saw mine, even when I couldn't see it myself." That night, back home in my quiet house, I updated my will one final time. The scholarship fund would still receive the bulk of my estate, but now there was a provision for David and his family as well, not a fortune, but enough to show that love. Once damaged, could still be repaired. I also wrote a letter to be opened after my death addressed to Emma and Jake and any future great-grandchildren I might not live to meet. In it, I wrote about the importance of choosing yourself, especially when others want you to choose them instead. I wrote about the difference between being loved and being needed, between being seen and being useful. Most importantly, I wrote about the possibility of change, about the fact that relationships could be rebuilt on better foundations if both parties were willing to do the hard work of seeing each other clearly. I sealed the letter. Hemingway jumped onto my lap and began his evening purr symphony. Through my kitchen window, I could see the lights of my neighbors' houses, each one containing its own stories of love and loss, and the daily choice to keep trying. I was 80 years old, living alone in a house I'd paid for with my own money, surrounded by relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I had a son who finally saw me as a person rather than a function, a granddaughter who was building the kind of life I'd once been too afraid to imagine, and a community of friends who valued my presence. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was 21 and thought love meant sacrifice. It wasn't even the life I'd imagined when I was 71 and still believed my worth was measured by how useful I could be to others. It was something better, a life built on the radical foundation of knowing I was enough, exactly as I was. Sandra had been wrong about one thing, I realized. I hadn't outlived them all out of spite. I'd outlived my old self out of love.